Yeah, doctor, you can start
Yes,
now. Doctor.
thank you, Saurabh. Thanks a lot. Today we have eminent speaker, Dr. Priya Kanappan. Ma'am is consultant ops and gynecology and fertility. Ma'am is currently working in Dr. Mehta Multi-Speciality Hospital, Chennai, and also associated with Madras Assisted Reproduction Center in Chennai. Ma'am had received a Best Ongoing and Best Resident Award from Manipal University. Ma'am has also done fellowship in obstetrics ultrasound, a fellowship in reproductive medicine, and fellowship in gynec endoscopy. So with this, may I request Dr. Priya Kanappaman on her talk, PCV and JDM Nexus. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you. Ma'am, you're on mute, so you have to unmute it. Still unmute?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay. A very good evening, one and all. Today's the topic for discussion will be the nexus of GDM and PCOS. Sorry.
Yes, we can see your screen, ma'am.
So before going into discussion, like first when they gave me the topic, we just wanted to know what is nexus means. So there is a difference of meanings in the dictionary. I mean, like, starting from concentration, from chain, series, succession. So this is nothing but a complicated and important series of connection between the PCOS and GDM. Yeah. So we all know PCOS has become an epidemic in India with the prevalence of almost 41%. Almost 1 in every 5 women have become diagnosed with PCOS, and 117 million patients have already been diagnosed, and the number is constantly raising. So coming to the complications, it ranges from infertility. Primary infertility has been reported to almost 50% of the women, and secondary infertility is almost 25%. And obstetric complications, 3 times higher risk of preeclampsia, 3 times higher risk of GDM, 2-fold increase in preterm labor, and 2-fold increased risk of IUGRs. And cardiovascular risk, there is 2-fold increase in myocardial infarction as well as hypertension. And metabolic, there is a 5 to 10-fold increase in the risk of developing diabetes mellitus. And in other and psychological, oncological disease, we know that there is an increased risk of endometrial carcinoma because of the unexposed higher estrogen level. And psychologically, these patients have been found to have 4-fold increase in the risk of depressive disorders and higher prevalence of anxiety also, and thereby there is a reduced in quality of life in the patient. So coming to the history, the PCOS was initially diagnosed by, though many people have reported earlier, rather than Steve Eventhal, in 1935, they reported 7 patients who had amenorrhea, hirsutism, and obesity. And when they operated on these patients, they had a polycystic appearing ovaries. So this polycystic ovarian disease is also called as Steve Leventhal syndrome, giving a credential to their name. And they have also found that a wedge resection has, was able to revert the hirsutism as well as the amenorrhea in this patient and was able to produce pregnancy. But the amount of ovarian tissue they removed, equivalent to 50 to 75% of the ovarian tissue, was removed those days by Steve and Eventhal. So we know PCOS, there is no clear-cut reasons or, etiology why this PCOS occurs. It is a complex relationship between the genetic makeup along with neuroendocrine, metabolism, environmental factors, with the problem with the steroidogenesis, as well as intra-ovarian oxidative stress, as well as cytokine release. All these processes being documented for the reasons for polycystic ovaries. So genes load the gun and the lifestyle pulls the trigger. So we all know the 2-hit metabolism, like 2-hit mechanism, which we usually document for carcinomas. The same can be implemented for polycystic ovaries. So in the fetal life, the first hit will be the genetic disorder, which will result in changes with the ovaries. And along with superimpose the second hit in adult life will be the environmental factors, along with metabolic imbalance such as lifestyle changes and obesity, which results in polycystic ovaries. So coming back, so the prenatal exposure to androgen has been implemented in polycystic ovaries, especially when the mother has maternal congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or if the mother has PCOS or an androgen secreting tumor. All these causes an increased androgenic milieu in the fetal environment, which results in insulin resistance and PCOS in later life. The second reason has been found to be a low birth weight, and SGA fetuses have a high risk of developing polycystic ovaries. So the other reason has been a premature adrenarche. There is the increase in the amount of adrenal hormone, or if a patient is already an epileptic or on anti-epileptic drugs such as valproate, or a type 1 diabetes which develops very early before menarche, that will be the reason for production, happening of PCOS, as well as obesity with or without insulin resistance, and family history of polycystic ovaries have all been implemented in the etiopathogenesis of polycystic ovaries. So this is a schematic diagram which shows the long-term metabolic complications and cardiovascular risk. So initially in the reproductive life, that is when the patient is young, there is more of menstrual disorders, hirsutism, and mostly they will come with cosmetic complaint, and they land up with either the pediatrician or the dermatologist. And once the life progresses, they land up with fertility, where we come into play a gynecologist, or they may develop diabetes, or including thyroid and prolactin disorder, they may land up with an endocrinologist. And in older life, they may have diabetes, cardiovascular risk, and cancer risk, where they may either land up with a cardiologist or a geriatrician. So obstetric risk in PCOS, we all know the risk of miscarriage is high, along with GDM risk of up to 50%, pre-IH, pre-eclampsia, including eclampsia is also very high. Preterm delivery, there is an increase in the perinatal mortality because of prematurity, SGA fetuses, and more chances of cesarean section. So when the PCOS mother, when she has a female offspring, there is a higher risk that the daughter will also have PCOS, increased LH, increase in the androgen, hyperinsulinemia. So there is a genetic component because of the familial association. Along with that, the environmental component, where there is an intrauterine hyperandrogenism because the mother is polycystic ovaries. The hyperandrogenic milieu plays a second hit which causes polycystic ovaries in the daughter. And the second, even in the male fetuses, they may have an increased tendency for hair growth, premature male balding, insulin resistance, increased risk of coronary artery disease, and hyperandrogenemia. So coming back to why this PCOS happen, there has been two postulated mechanisms why polycystic ovaries happens. One is the GnRH release pulse. The GnRH pulsality, when it is normal, there is a more of FSH increased hormone, which result in normal ovulation. When this GnRH is increased, when the GnRH is increased, there is an increase in the GnRH pulse. So this results in the LH, and the LH, when it is more, it results in hyperandrogenism, arrest in ovarian follicle development, follicular atresia, followed by anovulation. So this is a very, very important picture which you have to remember. This is a normal cycle where we know that the FSH is higher than the LH, and there is a mid-cycle LH surge followed by ovulation. So, and in the case of polycystic, LH level is constantly high. It is even higher in the earlier, that is in the follicular phase of the menstrual. A picture which shows that early antral follicle development happens. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. Hello?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay, so the early antral follicle results in antral follicle, late follicle, which becomes pre-ovulatory. In the case of polycystic ovaries, this process gets arrested. From the cyst. So the normal follicle, when it is like reaching the mature follicle, this phase gets arrested. So we get the follicle of 5 to 9 mm, and these multiple immature follicles, they form the polycystic morphology in the ovaries. So the second important mechanism for this polycystic ovarian disease is insulin resistance. There have been many reasons which has been told for insulin resistance. Lack of exercise, lack of quality sleep, more of carbohydrate, chronic inflammation, and genetics or the syndrome X, which is the metabolic syndrome of the PCOS. And we know that they have 3 out of 5 criteria to define this. And this is the apple and pear-shaped obesity, which is usually found in this women of polycystic ovaries. So either an abdominal waist circumference of 88, triglyceride of 150, HDL of less than 50, blood pressure 130/85, and abnormal GTT. This has been found to have a diagnostic value in the insulin resistance syndrome. So another important picture which we all have to understand PCOS is that, one, we already told the GnRH pulse frequencies increased. This, the only positive study which has shown that a lack of progesterone, that is low progesterone level, has a positive correlation for the increased frequency of this GnRH, which results in an increase in the LH level in the pituitary, and that results Pica cells, it acts and it produces hyperandrogenism. The other mechanism is the insulin resistance. Insulin resistance because of more of fatty acids and adipose tissues, and it causes hyperinsulinemia. This hyperinsulinemia has a direct effect on Pica cells to produce androgen. They act on the liver, it decreases the sex hormone binding globulin, thereby the free androgen level increases. So all these levels causes hyperandrogenism and the polycystic ovarian morphology. So insulin resistance accounts for about 20 to 50% of these patients. A compensatory hyperinsulinemia occurs, and it is seen in more than 70% of the PCOS women. It is more with obese women. It is 30 to 40% in normal weight, and almost 20 to 25% in women of lean PCOS. So even the lean PCOS, they have insulin resistance. And another thing is lean PCOS, they have also found to have more of visceral fat. That is the fat which is surrounding the visceral organs, and that is a result for insulin resistance. So, and this is a very, very important part which is to be understood, the peripheral insulin resistance, which results in hyperinsulinemia. This insulin acts on the Pica cells through the insulin-like growth factor receptors, and it produces androgen, and it directly acts on the liver to produce decrease in the amount of SHBG, all produces more of androgen, and this forms a vicious cycle. So increased in the free androgen level, this further aggravates the insulin resistance. Ultimately, these conditions, they foster a self-propagative positive feedback loop, and this feedback, this increase in severity over time. So what is insulin resistance? Why should we know that? If you understand this picture, it is very, very important to understand why myoinositols are used in the treatment of polycystic ovaries. One, usually know when the insulin binds to the insulin receptor, it undergoes conformational changes. So one is it undergoes tyrosine phosphorylation. Not very important, we may think it is just biochemistry, but to understand myoinositol, you have to understand on this step, and this tyrosine phosphorylation, this activates the phosphatidyl inositol 3-phosphate kinase metabolism, and this results in insulin related metabolism. For example, it activates the GLUT4, and it is responsible for the lowering of glucose produced by insulin, like your decreased gluconeogenesis, more of glucose utilization, and all the glycogen formation. All these depends on this pathway when this is a normal pathway. But in turn, when it is not, this is not getting activated, and it results in a PCOS condition where you have insulin resistance. So the serine phosphorylation gets activated. Once serine phosphorylation gets activated, it inhibits this normal metabolic pathway of the insulin. And this serine phosphorylation is in turn activated by free fatty acids. So once this pathway gets activated, there is more production of androgen. So insulin action is selectively inhibited as well as selectively enhanced. So though we call it insulin resistance, the good pathway of metabolism is inhibited, and the not very so good of serine phosphorylation, which is the mitogenic pathway, this gets activated. So thereby this insulin results in hyperandrogenism in spite of insulin resistance. So this is the more clarified pathway where you have, one is this phosphatidyl inositol pathway, and other one is mitogen activating protein kinase pathway, MAPK pathway, which is activated by serine. So in a normal situation, both the pathways are equally stimulated, so that the glucose metabolism also happens, and the growth, differentiation and inflammation, they occur to a normal extent, which does not cause any other side effects. But in the case of an insulin resistance, where there is a more of insulin resistance pathway, the growth, proliferation, atherosclerosis, inflammation, they get more activated rather than the glucose metabolism. So what is the key to successful treatment? Is we all know it is diet and exercise. Diet forms 75% of the treatment, with exercise forming 25% of the treatment. What kind of diet should we advise our patients? So to achieve a weight loss, the diet should be caloric deficient by 30%, which is almost 500 kilocalories less than the requirement. So the required diet for a PCOS patient should be 1200 to 1500 calories. So a 5 to 10% weight loss in a period of 6 months, it has been found to reduce hirsutism, acne, restore ovulation, as well as it improves the obstetric outcome. So top tips for PCOS, most of the patients, they come back and tell us, what kind of diet should I eat, doctor? You tell me what is the diet. So that for that, the simple tip should be to avoid all processed food, sugary items, sweets. Dairy should be avoided in a polycystic ovarian patient because it produces more of estrogen. Similarly, the soya proteins and high GI fruits such as the bread, cereals, pasta should be avoided. Processed meats has to be avoided. So healthy eating food should be your non-starchy peppers, spinach, sprouts, cauliflower. Proteins can be given, which includes egg, fish, chicken. We don't advocate red meat. Low GI carbs such as sweet potatoes, rice, and chickpeas and beans, and avocado oil. The requirement and the recommendations of oil has been differing from time to time. Now the recent recommendations, what they say about oil is that the vegetable oils, including your sunflower oil and safflower oil, is not very good according to the recent recommendations. And they say coconut oil, ghee, butter, olive oil is a better option rather than a vegetable oil. And you can give them fruits. These fruits are rich in antioxidant, and we already said one of the cause for PCOS is the inflammatory marker. So these antioxidants, they act as anti-inflammatory markers, which helps to get it back. And probiotic, prebiotic, definitely they have a very good role in a PCOS. So according to exercise in adolescents, we ask for 60 minutes per day of vigorous exercises. So this exercise should be a SMART goal. It should be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely goals. And self-monitoring should be advised, and the weight loss should be 5 to 10% over 6 months. So we don't recommend the patient lose all your weight in 1 month and come. It should be a slow process over 6 months. And for an adult, a minimum of 150 minutes a week, which is equivalent to 30 minutes of exercises per day. And it should also include your muscle training at least for 2 non-consecutive days a week. So whenever we have to advise, you advise the patient for minimum sedentary screen time, and a daily step goal should be at least 10,000 steps a day. SMART goals, even they can divide it as 10-minute bouts of 1,000 steps, which will again equivalent to 10,000 steps of goal, and progressively increasing the physical activity by 5% a week, and self-monitoring, especially a fitness tracking device or a pedometer or a step counter in their phone. They can just upload that, and then they can have a progressive view on what they are going on. So now coming to a complete consensus of what is the pathophysiology and where all can we treat. The initial treatment of genetics and other things are not modifiable. We cannot know, and we don't know what else to be done for this. The initial step where you can intervene is the insulin sensitizers. One is metformin. The other one, which is upcoming, is your myoinositols. Then tackling on the androgen excess. Most of the OGTs, we prefer to give oral contraceptive pills. If they go with an endocrinologist, they prefer for an anti-androgen, such as a flutamide, finasteride, or spironolactone. And in oral contraceptive pills, we all know the pills which contain cyproterone acetate is definitely, it has more benefit in giving a patient with PCOS, because it has other than oral contraceptive benefit, the cyproterone is a very good anti-androgenic property. So whenever you prefer an oral contraceptive pill, prefer a pill which has a cyproterone acetate. And then coming to ovulation, we know it is clomiphene citrate with or without metformin. Lactose can also give ovulation. The only drawback is that ovulation will not combat with any of the features of insulin resistance. So metformin should be considered, especially when features of metabolic syndrome is there, including lifestyle changes when it is not causing advantages. And it is helpful for patients who have a high risk group, such as a diabetic, impaired glucose tolerant, or a high ethnic group. And only problem with metformin is that many of the patients have side effects. So it should be, but most of the side effects are dose dependent and they are self-limiting. So you start with a lower dose of 250 milligram. You increment it 1 to 2 weekly till the required dose which you want, which ranges maximum up to 2 grams a day. This 1 gram BD you can go. And extensive release preparations, they have minimal side effect rather than the plain metformin groups. So, but there have been studies where shows that with metformin, by tackling this insulin resistance, can it prevent PCOS? So this is a study which is done in Taiwan over a period of 4 years between 98 to 2012, almost like 14 years it has been done. And they included 7,600 patients who have a valid PCOS diagnosis, and of which 3,100 patients, that is 42% of them, have conceived. The use of metformin did not reduce their risk of GDM, and there was another review and systematic meta-analysis was done on 2014, which also showed the same result, that use of metformin will not reduce the risk of GDM. So coming to your myoinositols and the role of PCOS, it works in both your obese as well as the non-obese women. So myoinositol, which is a nutritional supplement, and it is a second messenger, that is the pathway which we told was phosphatidyl inositol 3-phosphate kinase pathway. This myoinositol acts directly on that pathway and it improves the glucose metabolism. So it acts as a second messenger and it improves the insulin signaling pathway. So the ovulation rate as well as menstruation has been improved. It also been found as it decreases the risk of GDM in the patient. But however, we don't have higher quality studies, and still according to most of our guidelines, it's an experimental therapy yet, and we have to wait for further research to include this in the routine guidelines. So these agents are freely available. They are nutritional supplements, so they don't have any other side effects. They are low to moderate cost. They may have limited side effect profile, but they have a low quality evidence. So there is no satisfactory treatment regimen. So depending comparison of each of the pills which is used for the OC pills, we all know the metformin, it may aid weight loss for hyperinsulinemia, but however, insulin resistance is not the feature in all the PCOS, and GI disturbances makes it not very usable for metformin. Oral contraceptive pills, it causes anovulation, but it does not restore your ovulation. It may lead to weight gain, dyslipidemia, it may worsen your insulin resistance, risk of cardiovascular disease and thromboembolic events. Ovulation induction, it acts on ovulation but does not have any other aspect on the polycystic ovaries, and taken for a long time, it has a problem with central retinal veil occlusion causing blindness and ovarian cancer. And anti-androgens, and they usually combat only the hirsutism, so they do not have any other effect on insulin resistance, and taken over a long time, it can cause hepatotoxicity. So it is a vicious cycle of PCOS and ovarian on the insulin resistance. So as we know, GDM is defined as your glucose intolerance that is first recognized or it appears in the first time during pregnancy. And we all know it is closely associated with type 2 diabetes, and insulin resistance has been most common feature for both the GDM and the type 2 diabetes. So many people say the GDM is the type 2 diabetes which is occurring first in pregnancy. So and we all know diabetic classification of WHO can be type 1, type 2 or GDM. So why we all know that the placental hormones are the reasons for diabetic, but not all women get diabetic. Only few women get diabetic. Why is that so? Usually the normal women, they have the pancreas, which function enough to counteract the insulin resistance caused by these placental hormones. But when the pancreatic reserve is low, as in a case of a GDM or a patient with polycystic ovaries, 60% of them become diagnostic of GDM, and they even develop in the further pregnancy because of their pancreas reserve is reduced. So this is a beautiful picture which I really found interesting. This line, green line, is a normal woman. You can see in the first pregnancy also, this is a diagnostic threshold for diabetic. So she is like way above the diagnostic threshold in her first pregnancy. Even in her second pregnancy, she goes way above. In spite of the insulin resistance, she doesn't come into the diabetic range, and throughout she never develops diabetic. So this is a normal woman. But a woman who has a tendency to become diabetic, in the first pregnancy, either she becomes a GDM or an impaired glucose tolerance. Second pregnancy, she becomes an overt GDM or needing a therapy, including a metformin or an insulin. And further, after some time, she becomes a diabetic. So why GDM and epidemic unfold in India? We know it is a serious problem in the diabetic. Almost like 90% of the women, 6 million births, and 90% are due to GDM. And there is high prevalence of GDM, and patients, most of the patients, they don't get tested postpartum to diagnose diabetes mellitus, and most physicians, they do not screen despite there is clear-cut guidelines when to screen. So when coming to this picture, we have to understand, are we seeing the same disease? So a baby who can be either a low birth weight or a high birth weight, they may have premature adrenalarchy. That is, before the menses, they may have excess hair growth, and they attain puberty. They become polycystic ovaries, and in the pregnancy, they become GDM. Further, they become type 2 diabetes, and they develop dyslipidemia. And in the menopause, they may have endometrial carcinoma as well as heart disease. So this makes us think whether your PCOS, GDM, and type 2 diabetes, whether all of them are interrelated. So based on their epidemiology, we all know all three of them have the complications of hypertension, cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis. Their etiology is either insulin resistance and hyperandrogenemia. Histology of the placenta and all these conditions are similar, and epidemiological, they have also been interlinked. So the epidemiological link, PCOS increases the risk of type 2 diabetes. It increases the risk of GDM by more than 200%. They develop type 2 diabetes, and insulin resistance has been seen. So, and this has been, this is a study to show whether all three are heritable. Twin studies and genetic studies have shown familial clustering of PCOS. So whenever a patient comes to you with PCOS, the mother, sister having polycystic ovaries, there is an increased risk of this patient also developing polycystic ovaries. A child born to polycystic ovaries have a developing risk of polycystic ovaries, and a family history is very important. So the similar impact is seen in the placenta. Whenever you send a placental histopathology for the patient, either with GDM, PCOS, or diabetes, you see villous immaturity, villous necrosis, angiogenesis of and ischemic changes in the placenta. So PCOD, there is an increased risk of preeclampsia, neonatal hypoglycemia, as well as eclampsia risk is increased. So metabolic syndrome, as already mentioned, all three processes will have metabolic syndrome. So are we seeing only the symptoms, or are we seeing the problem and the cause? So we are just treating the symptoms, but we are not seeing the cause for the disease. So we all know that there is two basic mechanisms for development of PCOS. One is the hormonal imbalance, that is your GnRH increased pulsatility resulting in increased LH. So LH FSH imbalance, hyperandrogenism. Second one is insulin resistance resulting in hormonal metabolic imbalance, your dyslipidemia, and both of these together they results in oligoamenorrhea, anovulation, hirsutisms, impaired glucose tolerance, and obesity. But most of our treatment is managed for the symptoms, but we don't find what is the basic cause for these two. So the insulin sensitizers such as metformin can be used, your androgen, ocipils, ovulation inductions, and cosmesis. So we know all these things. Your insulin sensitizers acts at the metabolic level, anti-androgen for your hirsutism, ocipils for your anovulation hirsutism, ovulation induction only in for your anovulation, cosmesis for your hirsutism, but none of these actually act for the cause. Why these conditions happen, we are not addressing that. So it is difficult to nip your GDM from where it is developing. So the longer period of hyperglycemia and the, correlates with the more of complications. So early onset diabetes, the patients have more complication including your perinatal mortality, neonatal hypoglycemia, preterm deliveries. And earlier the initiation of GDM, and earlier the treatment initiation, there is a lower rate of macrosomia and large for gestational age. So the impaired GTT in the first trimester helps in diagnosis as well as prevention of most of these complications. So screening at the second trimester may miss out these early GDM patients. So can there be two answers to the to this dilemma? One is universal screening. The universal screening has to be done both in the first and the second trimester. And the treatment option should not only prevent GDM, but it should also help to manage GDM if the patient develops GDM. So depending on the fetal programming, this is a very, very important slide. You have to understand that. So depending on the environmental insult which occurs during pregnancy, the fetus may develop problem later in life. So first condition is an overfed state. For example, a GDM who's on a very high sugar level, who's not well treated. So these overproduction, the fetal pancreas, there is a sugar levels, the sugar transmit from the mother to the fetus. Once this hyperglycemia, they stimulate the fetal pancreas to produce higher insulin. So the higher insulin results in early beta 2 cells exhaustion. And once these beta cells get exhausted, the pancreas fails over time. And as the fetus grows up, these pancreatic cells get exhausted and they develop type 2 diabetes. So this is on a mother with GDM who's not well treated properly. That is an uncontrolled high sugar GDM patient. The second scenario is underfed state or maternal starvation. This is where we come to play, where we overtreat the patient, where we restrict the caloric intake, where we don't even give the required amount of carbohydrate, a totally no caloric, no carb diet. So if you restrict the carbohydrate diet to certain extent, the fetal pancreas produces very less insulin. So the production itself gets compromised. So once the production itself gets compromised, so the fetal pancreas fails to produce over time. And as the fetus grows, it produces subnormal amount of insulin and again they become diabetic. So fetal programming for GDM should have a normal diet variation where the mother should not be overfed to produce an increased amount of sugars, nor they should be underfed producing a very low amount of sugar. So both the things will cause disease in the in the fetus in the later life. So the mother should have a normal level of carbohydrate with a controlled amount of sugar levels. So the complications that can be minimized or avoided by the right treatment of GDM are almost every complication of GDM, including your preeclampsia, polyhydramnias, the occurrence of type 2 diabetes, perinatal mortality, your macrosomia, hypoglycemia, hyperbilirubinemia, as well as your hypocalcemia. So the urgent need to curb this epidemic is first, universal first trimester screening. Use of a single step, which is very important. Nowadays, our DIPSI is recommended in India, where we use a 75 grams glucose, irrespective of the fasting state of the women. You give a 75 grams glucose meal, and a single value of 140 is considered to be diagnostic of your GDM. And it should become a part of the routine assessment of every woman. You have to take preventive measures, early management. All the medical fraternity should be educated about this, and patient education. So management principles, as I've already told you, longer the period of hyperglycemia, more the complications. So the hyperglycemia should be dealt with earlier in the pregnancy, and the control should be in the right possible place so that the fetus does not have complications. So normalization of maternal glucose concentration, which results in pregnancy outcome. Nowadays, we don't ask for blood tests as well as like fasting postprandial blood test. We ask the patient for self-monitoring, that is the capillary blood glucose monitoring. Ideal should be 4 times a day, which includes a fasting and 2 hours post-meal. When we advise for post-meal, the very important advice with each patient should be given is the post-meal time should be started from the first bite of the meal. Why this is important? Because in pregnancy, the patient tend to eat very slowly. So they complete their food after half an hour of initiation of food. So then if you take a 2-hour post-meal, it becomes 2.5 hours. So the post-meal calculation should be from the first bite of the meal. And targeted glycemic control, ideal control should be a fasting of less than 95. A 1-hour post-meal should be less than 140. 2-hour post-meal should be less than 120. So this is the ideal target, and management should include diet, exercise, metformin, inositols, or insulin. And now the newer perceptive is the inositols has a role in both prevention as well as treatment of GDM. So this is the NRHM guidelines for the treatment of GDM, where the pregnant woman, when she comes in the community, in the first antenatal visit, she is given a 75 grams glucose. This is the DIPSI test, which is given irrespective of the meal, irrespective of the fasting state. So the moment the patient walks into the clinic, she is advised to take a 75 grams of glucose, and 2 hours after intake of glucose, she is advised to give a blood test. If that blood test is more than 140, she is managed as per GDM. If the glucose level is less than 140, then we repeat the same test after 24 to 28 weeks. And again, if it is positive, she is managed as per GDM. Negative, then she is managed as a normal antenatal care. So the current diagnostic, initially we were using metformin. Metformin, we know that it tackles insulin resistance. We have wide experience with metformin, but it has been proven in studies it does not prevent GDM, and you cannot manage severe cases. It is not tolerated by all, and it can cross the placental barrier. The results, fetal risk is unknown, but however, the FDA categorization is only category B. We all use it uniformly. It can be used. The second is insulin. Insulin, it is very efficacious. It gives a proper control of sugars, but it is an injectable. It causes hypoglycemic episode. It can cause weight gain in the patient, unable to prevent fetal complications, and it does not tackle the root cause, which is the insulin resistance. Myoinositols, they both prevent and manage GDM. They tackle the root cause, which is the insulin resistance. They lead to favorable fetal and maternal outcome, and in side effect profile, they are superior to metformin and they are safer. But there is limited experience. We don't have well-studied research and education, so that we cannot recommend it as a routine use, and it takes time to show the result, and it is confusing in terms of dosage and the formulation, because we all know it is available in every dosage, that is ranging from 500,000 to 2,000 or 4,000, that is 4 grams of myoinositols, and the different preparations such as 40:1 ratio and all possible formulations we all know. And there are clear-cut recommendations also, which will be dealt with my next speaker. So now coming to the NRHM guidelines for a pregnant women with GDM, the initial therapy will be medical nutritional therapy, which includes diet as well as physical exercise. So the diet should also have carbohydrates. So the carbohydrate should not be totally taken off of the diet. Some recommendation says you can give the carbohydrate up to 55 to 60%, and the ACOG says you restrict the carbohydrate to 45%, but no guideline says totally stop it. So carbohydrates are needed for the fetus. So you have to manage your diet accordingly, along with your proteins and saturated fat, which is the recommended range it has to be given. Physical exercise has to be suggested for every pregnant woman with GDM. If suppose if they have a risk factor where they are advised for bed rest, they can do this hand exercises, which is equivalent to walking. So you can just tell that. And after a period of 2 weeks, we do a 2 hours PPBS. And if it is less than 120, you continue with the medical nutritional therapy and you just monitor the PPBS alone. But if it is more than 120, you can either give metformin or insulin therapy and monitor them with fasting and postprandial, especially if they are insulin. You have to see them every 3 days in order to avoid hypoglycemic episodes. So the treatment plan is multidisciplinary. You have to have a close monitoring and treatment of GDM, which is very, very important for the mother and the baby. Lifestyle modification, including your diet and exercise, along with pharmacotherapy. So by proper management of the GDM, we can change from maybe to baby. So coming to a conclusion, so whenever you have a condition of GDM, so initially in the pre-pregnancy phase, you get the risk factors for patients who are undergoing GDM, and especially if an adolescent patient comes to you, she's obese and she has other risk factors for GDM, give the lifestyle management then and there. And if there is other medical disorders, you get for evaluation. Other hormonal imbalance should be corrected. Early diagnosis and proper management of glycemic control. Once they become pregnant, earlier universal diagnosis, universal screening should be implemented in the first antenatal checkup. And then you should advise between medical nutritional therapy, 2 weekly glucose monitoring, and the glucose, if it is more than 120, then you start initiation of your insulin or metformin. In the postpartum phase, especially, which is very, very important, which is missed in most of these patients, is that postpartum, first of all, most of them can be diabetic who can be diagnosed as GDM in pregnancy. So please check their sugars after delivery to confirm that it is only GDM and not a diabetic, and call them back after 6 weeks. Again, repeat a testing. Either you can do a fasting blood sugar or you can do an HbA1c. Most of the guidelines does not recommend OGTT, but if it is not wrong to tell a OGTT also. So depending on your preference, either you can do a fasting or a HbA1c or a OGTT, and accordingly give them advice. And lifestyle advice has to be given for every patient. And it has been found that exclusive breastfeeding has resulted in decreased insulin resistance. So for these women, especially where their offsprings are at increased risk of diabetes, kindly advise them for exclusive breastfeeding and give them a gap for contraception so that they can improve on their lifestyle changes and then plan their second pregnancy. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the excellent presentation. And yes, you have beautifully explained the link between the PCOS and the GDM, and especially the importance of screening of all this pregnant patient, which is very, very essential. So thank you very much. I have a short presentation on the role of myo-inositols in PCOS as well as in GDM. So I'll just quickly go through that. I'm sharing my screen. So is my screen visible?
Yes. No, I'm not seeing your screen. I'm seeing only you.
I'm sorry. Is my screen visible?
No.
I'm sorry. Now is it visible?
Yes. Prachi, can you just add 1 second? Hello, Prachi. Sorry.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to give a word. Like anybody who's having any doubts, please put it in the chat box so that we'll be able to answer you at the end of the session.
Yes, ma'am. I have already put that message in the chat box that if the doctors have any questions, they can add and post it over here. So this is my talk on role of myoinositol in PCOS and GDM management. Ma'am has already covered very beautifully the role of inositol in insulin signaling. So quickly, I'll go through that. I have seen this is the cell membrane, and we have insulin receptors. So when the insulin binds the insulin receptors, the beta subunit of this insulin receptor goes under phosphorylation, and there is an activation of this IRSC, which is the insulin receptor substrate. So when there is a docking IRS substrate or insulin receptor substrate, there is again phosphorylation of phosphatidylinositol, and which further causes the insulin metabolic action. So basically what I wanted to tell you is this inositol phosphorylation or phosphatidylinositol phosphorylation gives rise to the action of insulin or its metabolic action, and therefore its deficiency can cause insulin resistance. And when we add this nutritional supplement of inositol, that definitely helps in insulin resistance. So that is how we are coming or recommending the myoinositol in PCOS. It has been proved that myoinositol and D-chiroinositol are deficient in PCOS. So in PCOS women, the concentration of plasma concentration of inositol is much less as compared to normal subjects. Similarly, it has been seen that the excretion of inositol, that is urinary excretion of inositol, is much higher in PCOS subjects as compared to normal women. So that's what could be another reason why the deficiency of MI plus DCI is seen in PCOS. And therefore, whenever we add MI plus DCI in PCOS women, it gives rise to a normalization of insulin signaling and glucose metabolism. It also causes insulin resistance or diminishing of insulin resistance. It helps in decrease of androgen levels. It regularizes menses or menstrual cycles. And all these effects certainly help in restoring the fertility. So now, do we have data of myoinositol plus D-chiroinositol in PCS women, and especially the Indian patient data? So yes, definitely we do have Indian patient data. So effect of myoinositol plus D-chiroinositol in Indian PCOS women. This was paper presented at ISAR 2020. So this year in the month of March, this data or paper was presented. It is a single arm non-randomized pilot study. And the aim of this study was to observe effects of myoinositol 2 gram plus D-chiroinositol 50 milligram, which is given twice a day in micronized powder formulation for 3 months in patients who are diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome. 50 patients were enrolled in this trial, and the most important aspect is the clinical pregnancy rates were also observed in this particular study. So let us see the results. The inclusion from age of 25 to 35 years were enrolled in the study, and the diagnosis of PCOS is based on Rotterdam criteria. The exclusion criteria is patients with other causes of infertility like endometriosis or unexplained infertility or male infertility were excluded, and patients above 35 years of age or below 25 years of age were also excluded. And let us see the results in these patients. So it has been noticed that the FSH value has been increased, and right from baseline to the month 3, if you see, there is an increase in FSH value. The prolactin levels are considerably decreasing. It is the statistical significant decrease in the prolactin value. So P value has been shown over here. Also, the LH value is considerably decreasing as compared to baseline at month 3. So we are giving this treatment for 3 months. So we are comparing the baseline results with the 3 months results. And the most important aspect is AMH levels, especially in PCOS women. There is a statistical significant decrease in AMH level as well. The TSH values are also decreasing as compared to baseline. So what we are seeing results over here, that out of 50 patients, 46 patients had completed the study, 3 months of dosing. There is a statistical significant improvement in FSH levels and FSH and LH ratio. Regularization of menstrual cycles was seen in patients, and the most important aspect is 20% of the patient conceived after treatment with MI 2 gram and DCI of 50 milligram. So to conclude, this is the first Indian study to observe the effects of myo-inositol 2 gram plus D-thyroinositol 50 milligram in an Indian population, and specifically checking the hormonal parameters and the effect on pregnancy rates. Obviously, both parameters had shown improvement, that is hormonal parameters as well as clinical pregnancy rates. But as ma'am has already said many times, that there is a need of further randomized trials. There is another study which was done by Apollo Hospital, New Delhi, and studying the effect of myo-inositol on menstrual irregularities and the skin problems in polycystic ovarian syndrome. What we are seeing over here is after treatment with myo-inositol, the chances of oligomenorrhea have been considerably reduced, and only 7 patients had shown that. There is a considerable improvement in acne, so that's the another skin problem what we are checking it. And there is a modified FGS score. This score is specifically checked for the patients who have hirsutism. So the score of 8 or more than 8. So 8 is the cutoff point, which shows that whether if the woman has a score of 8 or more than 8. So that means it is an abnormal score. And with myo-inositol treatment, the score has decreased from 8 to 7. So that also gives an improvement in hirsutism. So basically, hyperandrogenism effects are taken care in the form of acne and hirsutism. So that's the data from the Apollo Hospital. We have a meta-analysis as well. So total 9 randomized control studies were done for this meta-analysis. This meta-analysis has significantly improved that there is a decrease in fasting insulin. It is a statistically significant decrease. Then there is a decrease in HOMA index, which is also statistically significant. And the trend of reduction of testosterone levels has been seen with the myo-inositol treatment. A significant increase in serum SHBG levels are seen. You have seen the P values are significant. The trial also indicates that sequential analysis of insulin meta-analysis illustrates a firm evidence of improvement of with the myo-inositol. So all this meta-analysis has indicated that there is a beneficial effect of myo-inositol in improving the metabolic profile of PCO-androgenism. We also have international consensus. The consensus is published in European Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology and Reproductive Biology. It is the consensus conference on myo-inositol and D-thyroinositol and suggesting the link between metabolic syndrome and PCOS. And it has suggested, or it has proved, that the clinical data of myo-inositol demonstrate efficacy of MI plus DCI in the treatment of polycystic ovarian syndrome, and the evidence is stronger for the 4 gram per day of myo-inositol treatment. So just to understand now PCOS and the gestational diabetes link. Ma'am had already covered these points beautifully, that it is an endemic. And as the type 2 diabetes levels are increasing, or more and more patients are becoming diabetic, obviously there is an increasing the prevalence of gestational diabetes as well. The most important point over here, which I want to mention, is the risk of developing GDM in PCOS women is approximately 3 times greater as compared to non-PCOS women, and this is because of insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. So in GDM also, which is a state of myoinositol and DCI deficiency, in GDM we see almost 36% lower myoinositol levels in pregnant patients as compared to non-GDM pregnancy. The DCI levels are also lower by 50% in diabetic patients as compared to non-diabetic patients. So do we have clinical data of myoinositol and DCI in JDM patients? Yes, there is a lot of data in JDM patients as well. So just to understand the first study, which tries to find out, or the objective of the study is occurrence of JDM in PCOS women. So all these PCOS women who were diagnosed, so total 98 PCOS women were enrolled in the study. So they have a PCOS and they receive treatment with myoinositol and folic acid. And half of the patient also received treatment with metformin. So after pregnancy, the women with PCOS who were taking myoinositol, they continued the treatment while the metformin group stopped their treatment. So the results what we received over here is the JDM incidence, and it has been seen that in MI group, myoinositol group, only 17.4% patients developed JDM, while in metformin group, the occurrence is more than 3 times, almost 54% patients developed GDM. So yes, we can prove that myoinositol can actually help as far as GDM occurrence is concerned in PCOS women, or prevention of GDM in PCOS women. The next study is about if the patients have history of type 2 diabetes mellitus, meaning family history of type 2 diabetes mellitus. So what is happening? So pregnant women, those who have a strong history of type 2 diabetes mellitus, so those women, around 197 women were enrolled in the study. Patients received myoinositol and folic acid versus folic acid alone. So let us see what are the results. It has been seen that in myoinositol group, the GDM incidence is much lower as compared to the GDM incidence in control group. So there is a 6% versus 15% incidence is there as far as GDM is concerned. Microsomia, yes, it is myoinositol group. No incidence of microsomia has been seen, while 7 patients in control group developed microsomia. The next study is obviously in GDM and whether myoinositol can tackle insulin resistance. As ma'am have beautifully explained that this is the one of the culprit as far as PCOS and GDM nexus is concerned. So there are 69 patients who are already diagnosed with the GDM. They were divided into 2 groups. One group received myoinositol plus folic acid and another group folic acid alone. So what are the results? We have different biomarkers as far as insulin resistance is concerned. So first is fasting glucose. In myoinositol group, there is a considerable decrease in fasting glucose as compared to control group. As far as fasting insulin is concerned, again, decrease is much more prominent in myoinositol group as compared to control. The HOMA index is also decreased significantly in a myoinositol group as compared to control group. And the next is adiponectin. The adiponectin levels are increased in myoinositol group as compared to, while there is a decrease in control group. And we are aware that adiponectin exerts the insulin sensitizing effects through binding to its receptor. So increase in adiponectin is obviously a better indicator of managing or tackling insulin resistance. The next study is about myoinositol versus insulin, and that too in GDM patients. So around 60 patients were enrolled in the study. In group A, they are divided into 2 groups. One group obviously received myoinositol, and second group received insulin. it has been noticed that around 75% patients who are receiving only myo-inositol showed the beneficial effect, and only 25% of women, so that is total number is 8, they require additional insulin. So only 25% patients required insulin plus myo-inositol, while the remaining 75% patients did not require any insulin, and they were adequately managed with myo-inositol alone, and these patients are with JDM. The another point which is important is myo-inositol group had less induction, or labor induction is less in this group as compared to insulin group. So almost induced labor were induced in this patient. So that is also a significant finding in this patient population. So to summarize, inositol is safe in pregnancy. The recommended dose is 4 grams per day. No side effects are reported with this dosage. If the dosage go on increasing, like say for 12 grams or 30 grams per day, then definitely there are side effects of nausea, diarrhea, flatus, etc. So recommended dose is 4 grams per day. We also indicate the myo-inositol plus DCI combination or ratio around 40:1. So that is the recommended ratio. Micronized powder is indicated because it gives better absorption, and better absorption definitely gives better efficacy. And better absorption and efficacy will give rise to better results as well. There is a Cochrane analysis available in GDM patients, which also indicates that myo-inositol shows promise in reducing the risk of gestational diabetes. This is the forest plot graph, again Cochrane analysis. What we are checking over here is prevention of gestational diabetes in PCOS women with the help of myo-inositol, and definitely favors the myo-inositol group. So this forest plot and the Cochrane analysis suggested that myo-inositol helps in prevention of gestational diabetes. There is another meta-analysis. Again, there is another 2 forest plots are there. This again a prevention of GDM, which shows the favorable results with myo-inositol. So helps in prevention of GDM, again proved with second meta-analysis. And the other forest plots is whether myo-inositol corrects the OGTT levels in GDM. So that also favors with myo-inositol favorable results as far as myo-inositol in GDM is concerned. So to summarize, myo-inositol plus DCI, that's the established treatment in PCOS. We have seen various Cochrane analysis. We have seen meta-analysis. So yes, it is an established treatment. Myo-inositol plus DCI can prevent the GDM and GDM-related complication. It can be used in the management of GDM. It is more effective as compared to metformin. It is as effective as insulin. The correct dose is 4 grams per day, and myo-inositol and DCI ratio is 40:1. So that is 4 grams per day of myo-inositol and 50 milligram per day, twice a day. That would be the DCI concentration, and they can safely given in pregnancy as well. So that was my presentation. Thank you. Thanks a lot for the patient sharing. So if there are any questions, we can take those questions now. Ma'am, I have a question for you. As far as the PCOS women are concerned, is there any genetic analysis or testing, or is there any prenatal counseling which is routinely done for these patients? Ma'am, you are on mute. You are on mute. You are on mute.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Actually, we tell them about the risk for GDM, and we screen for GDM and we go about it. But we don't scare the women saying that her offspring will become PCOS and her son will be diabetic and they will have all those things, because till now there is no genetic studies which is proven effective, and till now there is not even a gene which is told that this is the reason for PCOS. So we actually don't have anything in hand, so we don't tell the patients about that, but we always advise them for early screening for GDM.
So as far as PCOS women are concerned, there is only screening for GTM. That is the routine practice and nothing else.
Yes.
Saurabh, can you see any other questions in the chat box?
Actually, I see a question, but it is for you rather than me. Why no commercial preparations for 2-gram myoinositol is made available by Shield?
That's a good suggestion. Actually, we will definitely look into it.
Your APCOD is 2-gram myoinositol, right?
So what we are suggesting is 4 grams per day, and twice a day, that is the dose. So that has been taken. So if you want any other combination, so obviously we have to look into it. So that's the feedback what we are trying to give.
So is there any other questions? Anyone, you can unmute and you can ask us. So we'll be happy to answer you.
And another question, ma'am, generally how many PCOS women end up having the GDM in your clinical practice?
Actually, like whatever the guideline says, most of the obese PCOS, they land up with GDM. Okay, so if they are obese, most of them they land up, maybe almost 70-80% definitely they land up with the GDM. And for lean PCOS, the risk of GDM is comparatively less. Though we have a 30-40% risk of GDM in them also, but it is comparatively lesser than the obese PCO.
Okay, so obese PCOS, then definitely the risk of GDM is much more higher as compared to lean patients.
Yes, lean PCO.
And after the pregnancy or after the delivery, how many patients continue having diabetes or continue getting treatment? So
usually if it is a late onset GDM where they are only on meal plan, okay, a medical nutritional therapy, they need not have any other therapy needed. Most of them, they come back to normal. They don't even need any other therapy. So they become like, they have a normal sugar. They don't have any other problem. But if a patient is already on insulin, maybe like some people where they have very high dose of insulin, maybe some 10-20 units or even 40 units per meal, so 3 times a day, almost more than 100 units, they definitely become diabetic straight away. Even after delivery, they'll become diabetic. So you cannot cut down on the therapy and say that they are GDM. So they become diabetic. So it depends upon what is the therapy they need in pregnancy. So if it is a meal plan, most of them, they don't become. But if it is insulin and they need a higher dose, they become diabetic.
okay, so ma'am, you also said that probably after the delivery, 6 weeks later, they have to visit the clinic again and do the retest.
Yes, that is what the recommendations say. Any patient who's GDM, the risk of having a diabetic or an impaired sugar is very high. Why this is important is that, initiating a lifestyle change in them can postpone the occurrence of diabetes by at least 5 to 10 years. So, like if you call them at 6 weeks and the patient is found to have an impaired sugar, so you can at least tell them that the chance of having diabetes is high, annual screening is important for them, and lifestyle changes including diet and exercises can be implemented straight away. So for that only we call them after 6 weeks.
Right, ma'am. That's correct. Ma'am, what is your confidence and practice pattern with myoinositol alone in PCOS and
Actually,
GTM?
I believe in myoinositols. So for all my PCOS women, I give myoinositol. So I mean, most of them, they come back with insulin resistance. Now some feature or other will be there. And what I have seen is at least 40-50% they conceive. Anyway, even without that they can conceive. I don't know, but I believe they conceived with myoinositols. So I give to most of my patients.
Ma'am, there is a question, if the patient is pregnant and PCOD, so can we continue the myoinositol in this patients in pregnancy?
Yeah, if for example, like if I give a patient with myoinositol and she's conceived, I at least like to continue it up to 12 weeks minimum. If you continue it further, it is not a problem, because sometimes the risk of miscarriage can be reduced. And what I have been taught by my professor, she strongly believes that any drug which is given to conceive, or which is taken prior or in and around conception, you'll never know which is the drug which is helping the pregnancy to progress. So the moment you're going to stop that drug, maybe they can lead to abortion. And after 12 weeks, your risk of abortion is very, very less. So if given a patient, I've given that, I continue till 12 weeks, and then I take a call and stop that. So till 12 weeks, or at least till 8 weeks, because after the appearance of FH, and once they cross 8 weeks, the chance of abortion is very, very less. So I continue till that week and then only stop.
Yes. And one more question is 2 grams MI. So by the Shield, we do have preparation with MI plus DCI. MI is 2 grams in that, and 50 milligrams of D-chiroinositol. So that's the combination we have. So that's exact the combination what you have suggested. So
Yeah,
that's the
I mean, like,
clarification.
there is no clear-cut definition whether you have to take only plain myoanisitols or in combination with D-chiro. The only thing is, when D-chiro, when it's given in a very high dose, they are not very good. They are more deleterious. But 50 up to 50 is proven to be normal, one thing. And that 40:1 ratio is very, very important. So you have to maintain that. And another more important is your myoanisitol dose should be more. At least the minimum of 2 to 4 grams works. The like 550 or 500 minimal doses, I feel they may not work. So if you give for a combination, choose a drug which has at least a myoanisitol of 2. And if you want a combination, you can go for anything else. Both works. So there is no clear-cut definition whether myoanisitol alone or a combination is better. Both works well.
Yes, ma'am, what you say is absolutely correct, but we do recommend that myoinositol plus D-chiroinositol should be used more and more, because both combined together can give kind of synergistic effect as far as the PCOS patients are concerned. And any more questions? So I don't see any more questions. So ma'am, if you want to add something more information, please welcome, or else we will close this webinar.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, if everybody else doesn't have a question, I think we can say, we can end the meeting by saying bye to everyone.
So thanks a lot. Thank you, ma'am. Excellent presentations, especially covering both PCOS as well as this continuum DGM and management of this gestational. So thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prachi. Thank you for your extensive explanation about your myoanisitol. Thank you. So if there is no questions, we'll end the talk. So
yes, ma'am. We can close this webinar.